Very good. Okay. Well, Alan, it's a very great pleasure and a privilege to be interviewing you, turning the cameras on you. And I should explain that I'm Harvey Whitehouse. I'm interviewing Alan Macfarlane in a rare opportunity to mine his long experience of anthropology and of many other topics. And Alan, I'd like to start by asking you about your interest in collecting, because I know this is a long-standing thing for you. Do you see yourself as a collector? Would that be a good description?
Absolutely. If you ask me why, I'll give you another answer. But the fact is that from very early on, I mean, like all boys, I suppose I collected marbles and toy soldiers and animals and so on. I wasn't outstanding in any way. But what was odd about my collecting was that at about the age of 14, I decided that I would collect everything as much as possible about my life, my own life. So from about 14 or 15, I tried not to throw away anything like postcards or school essays or photographs or whatever, even Christmas cards. And so I have possibly the biggest academic archive in the world, something like 600 boxes of everything I kept. And certainly from Oxford onwards, I kept carbon copies of my own letters to other people, so I have both ways in the correspondence. I'm the only person, for example, as far as I know, who has a two-way correspondence with Hugh Trevor Roper, the historian, his letters to me and my letters to him. And so I'm an obsessive collector. Today my wife was cutting my hair, and I said, "Oh, let's not throw that away." So we put it in a pot which I'd already got a couple of my teeth in. So I obviously hoped that one day someone will reconstruct my DNA and bring me back to life. Anyway, yes, I'm a big collector.
Have you or your wife or other family members ever tried to sort of dig deep into the psychology behind this? What is motivating?
No, no one else except myself is probably interested to do so. I mean, I have my own theories. One is it's inherited, an inherited tradition.
Mm-hmm.
The British Empire was a very strange empire because basically, unlike all other empires, you sent people to different parts of the empire, but they remained in their heart and mind at home. And as a result, their contact was at home, and often they sent their children home, which is what happened to me. So the imagined community of the British Empire was held together by letters. And so my grandmother and generations before that, because I have 12 generations worth of relatives I know a lot about, going back to the first white child born in Jamaica in 1655, my family wrote letters and kept them and carried them wherever they went, and other things, photographs, because that was all you had of your children and your wider family. So my grandmother, particularly, who brought me up because my parents were abroad, collected, and I saw her drawers full of her time in Burma and India and elsewhere, and my mother was quite keen on keeping things too. So I saw that other people thought this was a very worthwhile thing to do. So that's one part of it. The other part is that one part of me never wanted to grow up. I grew up in Wordsworth Valley in the Lake District from the age of 12, and so I modelled myself on Wordsworth and the Prelude and the idea that in childhood we see much more clearly than we do as adults and in a more integrated, holistic way. And I didn't want to lose that. I didn't want to use the magic and enchantment of childhood. So I clung on to it by reading romantic poetry and children's stories and things. But part of it was also keeping the remnants of all that. So I kept my childhood toys, which I still have, and things like that. So it was retaining my past. Another thing was that I wanted to become famous. Now, my plan B was I would throw myself off Niagara Falls in a barrel, and for 1 minute I would be famous. But the alternative was that I would keep everything about myself. So if I ever distinguished myself in a medium way in any activity, my biographer or anyone else would have ample materials for my biography. So that was another feature. And another was about not losing the past. I mean, I became a historian and very interested, and certainly having worked on other people's archives and written books about 17th century clergymen whose diaries remain, I've always felt as a historian that it was a sort of duty of mine to provide materials for future historians, more than just one-dimensional, not more than just diaries or letters, but everything. And perhaps the last thing to say about that is that I think Thomas Hardy has some remark about that it's the very small, insignificant things which are important. And I've always believed that, one day someone will look at my train tickets or the plays I went to, or all sorts of paraphernalia that I kept, and that will give them clues just as important as my writings or anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And I often wished that some of the people I studied, I made studies of great thinkers like Tocqueville and Montesquieu and so on. I'd always wished they'd kept more. So for a jumble of reasons, I collected and kept things.
I can't help wondering if there's some kind of connection between the desire for fame and the desire to conserve historically interesting materials. And in particular, I wonder if there's any distinction in your mind between the idea of being famous now and being famous posthumously and leaving a legacy and being famous through the centuries to come. Is that which of those two things is most motivating for you?
Well, it's a good question, because I'm not interested in being famous now. I won't be, and I am not. I'm quite well known, certainly in China, and to a certain extent, to a certain generation of scholars in this country, but not famous. But I was aiming at 100 years, 200 years. My great teacher and mentor, Sir Keith Thomas, when he read 2 or 3 of the volumes out of 10 that I've written so far up to the age of 30, he said, "Alan, this will make you immortal." And he's a judge of these things, which pleased me enormously, because that's really what I'm striving for, immortality, so that one day I will be, on the shelf with Pepys and Gilbert and all these people. Doesn't matter now. But I don't know why, I won't be around to see it, although I possibly will, because strange development in the last 3 years of my life, actually before COVID, going to China a lot. I met a lot of Buddhist monks, top Buddhist monks, sort of 3 or 4 out of the top half dozen monks in China, and 3 of them, quite independently, said to me that after talking to me and looking at the strange hands I have, one line for head and heart, I was a reincarnate Lama, and I was a Bodhisattva, a Rinpoche, and that I was destined to be one of the kind that comes back. So I've sort of built this into my fantasies, and this wasn't a justification for collecting and keeping, but now I realise that I can come back as whatever I come back as, and read my own life with more detail in the future.
When you imagine yourself coming back in another life, is it a sort of fantasy in which you would have all the knowledge you currently have and could build on that, or would you be starting afresh?
I hope the former.
Yeah.
Because although I don't have any, I'm not one of those people who thinks they have been, and I don't have any premonitions or beliefs in anything I've been before, as some people do. I have, talking to people, I have a sense that I have bits of knowledge which are unusual, and one explanation might be that I've accumulated them in previous existences. Because another odd pattern of my life is that I've gone from utter mediocrity in my educational attainments and childhood and so on, to something above utter mediocrity. So gradually I've cumulatively gained in understanding of myself and the world, which has meant that I've seemed to have drawn in knowledge which I could have easily attained through reading and anthropology today, but it might also be some dragging clouds of some previous existence with me.
You seem very ready to accept the judgment of teachers and parents and other authority figures in your childhood that your performance at school was mediocre, and equally one could argue that the judgment of your peers and of the academic community at large that a life as a professor at Cambridge, sort of senior academic, is a demonstration of achieving more than mediocrity. And of course both of those things are likely to be true, but have you ever questioned the basis on which we make these judgments and wondered if they really are fairly attributable to yourself?
Well, with all such things, you leave a corner of doubt. But what I do is what Mark Bloch, the historian, suggested historians do. They bring a number of different sources to bear on the same issue. And so if I just had one school teacher who said Alan's got potential but he's not really living up to it, or one of my parents or grandparents said Alan's struggling and finding it difficult to read, or whatever their judgments on me were, or he's not scholarship level and we're not going to even enter him for a scholarship at all. I think they knew what they were talking about, and I accept it. What they all would have also said is that this is nothing to do with what you're going to achieve in your later life, because this is how you are now. And what they might not have realized as much, because the same thing happened with my uncle, who became very successful. And when he wrote a reference for me to go to university, to Oxford, he said, Alan's got a lot of potential, but he's a very late developer, as I was. But he went on to be a knight and a member of Parliament for Cambridge and so on. So I was a late developer, and I did that partly self-consciously, because it's holding your emotional and intellectual development. I held it on a rein because I wanted it to last as long as possible before it vanished. So I wanted to prolong that moment. I knew life was long. So just take it slowly. And I did the same with my academic career. I didn't get a job, really, even coming to King's at 30. And my first paid job as an anthropologist at 34. So I just took lots of degrees. Why hurry? Why not just prolong the moment? So my first judgments from all these people are 3/4 right, but they didn't predict anything. And then these later judgments as to my bodhisattva status, I take with a pinch of salt, partly because, of course, if I am a Zen Buddhist, I'm the last person who should say I'm a bodhisattva. Indeed, if I said I was one, I wouldn't be one. So I can spread the rumour without agreeing to it.
Very good. Well, going back to the collecting thing for a moment, one dimension of this that we haven't touched on is that a lot of what you've collected constitutes data, and I know you think about it as such. And I'm wondering, what would you pull out as the main findings, if you want to use that word, or the main, what have we learned from the data that you've amassed over the years?
Well, this question was asked me by my wife, Sarah, about 9 months or a year ago. She said, Alan, just scribble down what you learned from your life, and I'll read it in a couple of weeks. So I started, actually now I don't write so much, I record, I talk to the camera and then transcribe it. So I did that, and predictably it wasn't a week or two, it was about 3 months. So this next book is going to come out. It's called What I've Learnt About Myself and the World, and it's based on Montaigne's essays. The idea is to take a subject, like I even took some of his, like coaches or on cannibals, and so I sit down and I say, what have I learnt about cannibalism in my life, or what have I learnt about meekness, subject to dear to your wife, and maybe something on meekness, on modesty or envy or hatred or political correctness. What have I learnt about it? And I just talk for 10 minutes, which produces a short Montaigne-like essay. Like him, I just let my mind flow in the direction it wants to go. His essays are wonderful because you don't know what they're really about till you've read them. So this is a 800-page book. I've just got the proofs. And so to digest 800 pages is a bit hard. How many things am I allowed to reduce it to?
Well, maybe your top 3.
Top 3 things I've learned. One is that, I mean, most of them come from Einstein. I'm a great fan of Einstein's Bon mot, and probably my most favourite Einstein quote, which is inscribed on a sundial, which is in my garden, is make things as simple as possible, but not simpler. And all of art, all of life is caught in that. All art deceives and lies by making things simpler than they really are. All models, all academic life reduces it to simplicity. But it gets to a point where if you simplify it more, E equals mc squared, fine, but not E equals mc. So my life has been gradually building up wisdom so that I can see the tendencies or patterns in human history and human cultures. And so I think that's and the satisfaction of doing that. Starting, my dear friend Marilyn Strathern's motto is complexify.
Yes.
On the, to me, fallacious belief that you should model reality at a 1-to-1 ratio. But of course you can't. So you've got to do it at 1 in 1,000 or 1 in a million. And therefore, if you just complexify, you just confuse everyone, including yourself. So I believe in simplicity, and my teacher, Keith Thomas, taught me how to write in that simple, clear fashion. I'm trying to think of which of Einstein's other theories. One we talked about in your interview, which I think is very useful, that no problem will be solved at the level at which it's set. So, for example, if you want to get rid of gun crime in America, you can't go to America and look at gun crime and sort of think of ways of doing that. You've got to pull right back to guns and their role in different civilizations. You've got to look at the whole history of American frontier mentality. You've got to look at Puritanism and its confrontational binary view of the world, and so on and so on. You get above the problem. A lot of my recent work has been trying to get up above world problems and looking down. A third thing, I mean, this isn't necessarily the ones I think of is perhaps a solution to David Hume's observation, one of my favourite observations, which is roughly in his language, let a man of no whatsoever great understanding and intelligence encounter an object with which he is in no way familiar. There is no way he can, by the use of his reason, understand it. So basically, we are trapped within an inability to understand the world, because how can you make the leap out to an entirely different cosmology or philosophy or something if you've got no thread? It's the old problem with computers, bootstrapping. How do you get to another computer? Now, Hume I hugely admire. So what was he meaning? Was he wrong, or did he mean something else? And I've gradually come to realize that he meant something else. You can't solve these problems by reason. You can't think your way into another culture or another person. What you do is basically, and this is the difference between machine learning and artificial intelligence and human beings, what you do is you use your senses, because, as you know, Hume's theory of knowledge was that we get all our knowledge through sense impressions. So we know Hume was wrong if you take it literally, because a child is born into a world in which they don't speak any of the languages, they know nothing. An anthropologist goes to another society which they know nothing, and yet something comes out of it, and the child learns to understand what they could not have encountered before. And they do this through two things. One is the senses. They use their eyes, their ears, their noses, and they get the impressions of a buzzing world around it that goes into their minds, and then they sort it out into some patterns of predictability, tendencies, and if I touch this, then I'll burn myself, and so on. And the second thing they do, which is why all children are great scientists, they use the Baconian, or actually the Baconian Newtonian method of hypothetical inductivism. In other words, they guess. As Poincaré put it, all science is based on guessing before demonstrating. That is how science proceeds. So a child thinks, well, if I walk in that way, I guess I'll be all right. And then they meet a bear and they realize they've made a bad decision and they come back. So they make hypotheses, and then reality corrects them. And then they revise their hypothesis. And all academic work is also done in that way. So through endless curiosity and guessing and adjusting to what you encounter, a child learns about the world, and that's how anthropology works too, and how we can get round Hume's objection.
I think you're right. It's how anthropology could work, how it perhaps should work. In my view, at least, it's how it should work. But those three arguments are successfully an argument against extreme relativism, an argument against interpretive exclusivism, and thirdly, an argument against the anti-scientism, or whatever you want to call it, in anthropology. All three arguments would be deeply uncongenial, I suspect, to Marilyn Strathern, but also to many other anthropologists who are our friends. And I wonder how you've struggled to deal with that fact over the course of your long career.
I don't struggle at all, I just ignore it. I know it's wrong, and so there's no point in struggling against it. I also have one sort of useful tactic when they start on about these things, and we'll take them one by one. I just say, oh, well, that's fine, you're an anthropologist, I'm a historian. We don't think alike. But more seriously, let's put them to me one by one, and I'll see whether...
Well, the first argument that you made was about, the impossibility of comparison for extreme relativists. That was your first point, as I understood it. That, in other words, you can't simply understand a particular cultural system in terms of itself. You also need to do this comparative work and this historical work and other kinds of work.
Mm. Well, how can you understand it in terms of itself? I mean, it just seems so ridiculous. I mean, what do you mean by in terms of itself? You're not usually a member of the society. You come in, and how are you going to understand the first thing about it without? I mean, all thought is relativistic. I mean, relational. The great Nobel Prize winning Dr. Black said, we are born comparativists. You don't see anything directly, you see it in comparison to something else. So you don't see white without seeing black or comparing it to other colours. So when you go into another culture, you are totally deluded if you think you're just going and seeing it for itself and forget all of your whole background and training and everything else.
Well, I've always understood the concept of thick description as advocated by Clifford Geertz, for example, to be essentially just that, to interpret culture with reference to other parts of the cultural system rather than to try to relate it comparatively to other cases that have similar, maybe common denominators or whatever. But I take it you and I'm not imagining that we sort of shouldn't do that kind of project, but the idea that we do it exclusively to leave out other possible strategies, including reduction, which was your second point. Maybe we should move to that. Reduction.
Well, coming back to Geertz, I mean, he's playing all sorts of tricks. I interviewed him, a very good interview, and we all were brought up with the barley and cockfight and so on. But he, that is not thick description. Most of it is analytic. He describes something in a short space and then says this is meaning that and so on and so on. We know from supervising PhD students, if they go on thickly describing for more than about 2 pages, you lose the reader. You can do it better with film and other media because it entrances different senses than reading. But if you just describe something, in any way it's an illusion that you're just describing it, because what you're picking out has already been shaped by your analytical frame in thinking you're describing it. We're not, human beings are not cameras. I mean, when I talked to Audrey Richards about her work on the Chisungo rituals, which is very famous, she said, Alan, of course, I only captured a little bit of what I saw. I couldn't keep up with all the different things that are happening. I just selected this out and that out. So at that point, it's as naive as thinking that a camera is innocent of the person who's filming. The angle you do it at, and all those things determine what you see, and your framework determines. So pure description is an illusion. And thickness is insupportable at great length. So that's point number one. Point number two?
Point number two was really about reduction. So you were talking about Einstein's principle that to explain a phenomenon at one level, you need to be open to the explanatory potential of phenomena at another level. And I presume another word for this would be an openness to reductionism. But this is considered a dirty...
What do you mean exactly?
Well, the ability, for instance, to explain features of the cultural systems that we as cultural anthropologists or social anthropologists study in terms of underlying psychology. What Maya Fortes called the distinction between the how-type questions and why-type questions is one way to conceive of it. To ask for an explanation psychologically for recurrent features of culture around the world, something that interests me enormously, as you know, requires a reduction from the level of culture to the level of psychology. And psychology requires a further reduction under certain circumstances to the level of brain activity. So, and I guess you're comfortable with that idea, I take it from what you say, but not all of our colleagues are. In fact, actually a diminishing minority of them are, in my experience.
You've got to. I mean, if you just describe something at the same level as that, there's no kind of causation involved.
Exactly.
We were discussing an example with the brilliant book by my friend Kate Fox on understanding the English, and she describes cueing behaviour or linguistic things like talking about the weather. So that's delightful, that's a description of some of the features of the English. But my mind, why do we cue? What does it tell us about our senses of time, about equality, individualism, all sorts of features which I think are in English culture, which led to us to love to cue. And the same with why do we talk about the weather? We don't talk about the weather because it's a particularly interesting subject. We talk about it because of our class system, among other things, which means that when you meet a stranger, you don't know anything about them, but you need to establish who they are, and within 2 sentences you can get their accent, their political and intellectual attitudes, and much more, and it's neutral, and you can then go on with the conversation or break off. So talking about the weather is a gambit between strangers, and that my mind is then satisfied. I reach a point at which okay, I understand why it happens, and all the time I'm trying to find out understanding why it happens. To describe it at the level of itself doesn't help you understand why it's there.
One of the delightful things about interviewing you is it's incredibly absorbing, but one of the costs of that is that the time is going faster than I anticipated. We're already halfway through. So I'm going to shift gear and talk about a different topic for a few minutes, if that's okay. I mean, one other aspect to your long career in academia that I find intriguing and interesting is it may sound prosaic and dull, but the administrative side of your life. And I'm very curious to know what changes you've observed from, let's say, the 60s when you were a student through to the present time in terms of the sort of whole administrative machinery that lies around us and becomes very deeply involved in our lives in universities.
Well, one of the things I was going to ask you when you gave your account of your work as head of the department at Oxford is that you clearly achieved a great deal, which means that you're a good administrator, and not all academics are. Your teacher, Alfie Gell, for example, was pretty appalling.
Yep.
Or else he was a very cunning person, because he made out that he was appalling and therefore he wasn't asked to do anything or much. But as I've described in one of my autobiographical books on King's and Cambridge, administration, I'm reasonable. Ernest Gellner, one of the nice accounts, when I asked Ernest, are you ready for all the administration you'll do in Cambridge? He said, yes, I'm pretty good. My view is taken from a friend of mine, Sandy MacDonald. He always keeps his hat and coat on when he comes to a meeting, because it's not going to last for more than a few minutes. And so metaphorically, Ernest used to do that, but he was hopeless because he was too rational, too logical. He wasn't interested and he didn't understand Cambridge, so meetings went on forever. Anyway, I was quite good because I wasn't keen on it, but I wanted to do it well. And I also learned that if you put enough energy into it, it can be quite fun, in a minor way. It's like playing a game, and when everyone's pulling together and you get a good result, then you go out feeling fine. It's also a necessary part of relaxing in academic life if you just sat there writing books or even teaching. So you need committees to sort of sit around and waste time on while you relax, and if you're Trevor Roper, draw little pictures of other people at the committee. So I see it as quite a useful, easy thing. But what has happened, and here's an example of reductionism. Why are universities almost now totally destroyed? And all institutions almost totally destroyed, the health service, Parliament, academic universities and so on by administration. What has happened to undermine my colleagues here now, I've left for a long time, just tell me it's appalling the world they live in. There's just endless administration. And my daughter, who's a nurse, tells me the same in admin books and so on. What's happened? Well, there are various things. One, of course, is Parkinson's famous law that administrators expand to fill the space available, or putting two of Parkinson's laws together. So basically, if you're an administrator, you want sub-administrators and you create sub-administrators. Secondly, administrators know nothing about what they're administering. They've got MBAs and so on. They come into an organisation and they apply their rules they've learnt there, which have no bearing whatsoever. So all they can do is standardise things, all the sort of things that Marilyn Strathern wrote about, but actually practiced herself. She was an extremely good, but much too over obsessive administrator. Not much too kind of, sorry to Marilyn, but she, kept lots of files and so on, was a very careful administrator. So transparency, accountability, comparative, whatever, all that stuff taught in business schools comes into all organisations and destroys them. Combined with, it's all coming from America. When I came to my department, just before I was in the department, Maya Fortis was professor, and there was department meetings were held over lunch in a local pub, and Maya would say, we've got to work out the tripos next year. We'll do the same as last year, but so-and-so's away, etc. And the meeting was done with a pint of beer, and it was over. Gradually, over the years, I watched it build up, and Marilyn brought in really good minuting and accounting and so on and so on and so on. And in the university, the same. The number of administrators in the university has probably gone up tenfold, while the size of the university has gone up, 50% or something. And that's to do with the law and individualism and equality, something that Tocqueville could have predicted in his predictions of what was going to happen in America as a result of over-equality. The idea that everyone is equal, born equal, has equal rights and equal opportunities, means that all the time you have to justify and make absolutely clear why someone gets some advantage over some other person. I saw this with the promotions system in Cambridge. I was chair of the mini promotions meetings that we had in our faculty and the heads of department would sit around. I was a reader, and so I was chair, and they would say, well, we've got to put in a list of professorships, and one of them, Ernest, would say, well, so-and-so has written a good book recently, and then Colin Renfrew would say, well, so-and-so's also written a good book, and then they'd say, well, you had the last one, you better have this one, or he's a bit older and he's been here longer or something. Half an hour and it's all done. Then one particular individual in this university, a woman, was not promoted, and no one thought, I better be careful. Some people didn't think she should have been promoted, and she sued the university for about 5 or 10 years, and she didn't win, but the result was that the whole thing was turned into a farce thing. You had to have 3 referees for each person, you had to have several stages and so it took 2 or 3 weeks of each of the academics on this committee's time instead of an hour, in case you got sued, and to show to everyone that due process was being done. So a mixture of these different things, and then of course well-known law that if you have an institution promoting something, then it will So business schools, the Judge Business School, the whatever it's called in Oxford, Business School, and the ones in America and so on, they turn out these people who have got to have jobs, high-paid jobs in institutions, telling them how to run their institutions. Because before, we did it all. That's what I warned Ernest, he would have to do everything, delegated power. He said, oh, but at the LSE they do it. And I said, yes, they may, but here you do it. And it was a bit of a shock. We still do it in this college. Our meetings, the papers are that thin, and the meetings are usually short and efficient because it's all carefully, and it's done on the basis of trust and custom and mutual understanding. So it's very light and easy. But once the trust is lost and legal influences come in, it just spirals out of control.
This is absolutely fascinating, and I wonder, because you've described several of the key problems, from Parkinson's law to the sort of Tocqueville principle to all the causes, let's say, or at least some of the causes of the runaway inflation of bureaucracy, and a possible solution, which you say trust is very important to, that is exemplified by the way meetings are done in King's College. What if one were to set out to improve all these dreadful, over-engineered bureaucratic systems in universities, in red brick universities, for example, based on the wisdom of the King's College principles? How would it be done? What would you, if you were the troubleshooter going in to sort all these systems out, how would you approach it?
Well, trust is, again, got to be explained. It's a side effect or consequence of other things. Even trust and community is being broken down by all of this in Oxbridge colleges, and this college is an example of it. But there's still a lot of it. When a colleague of mine says this is a good student, I assume it is a good student. I don't have to check it out or anything. When they say things, I assume that my colleagues are telling the truth, and that they'll tell me unpleasant truths as well as. And this is partly because there is a lot of egalitarian. It's a very equal sort of community. It's also rather exclusive. So you feel that if someone's got into this club, then you can trust them. They've been through the vetting process before they came here. So if I was to, hired in to go to wherever it is, Lampeter, where I used to examine, David Shanklin and so on, and they said, how can we import this sort of thing? I had said, well, build up the sense of community as much as possible. Concentrate on all the things that make people feel they are within a community. So these are the simple things that you find in all human societies, particularly tribal societies: eating together, drinking together, playing games together, doing projects together. So you get all your staff, actually, as apocryphally Max Gluckman did in Manchester. You go to the rugby and football games together and go home and have parties. This is the sort of thing that Jack Goody was particularly good at. Why he made our department so good. It was really his legacy that you came to. Because, the whole department and graduate students felt together, and they went to his home and had drinks, and they became friends. And so hierarchies were broken down and trust was built up. You could, in theory, do that in any organisation. But probably the first thing is you'd have to get rid of the managers. And since they control it, they are 100% dedicated to eating away the system in the way they want to. Whereas the academics, this is only 10% of their lives. They don't want to bother about it. So when some administrator says, I can do that for you, it's very difficult to say, no, I should be doing that.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to shift gear as well again now because of the time advancing so quickly to a question about disciplinary boundaries, because obviously, you have a career both as an anthropologist but also as a historian, and are quite used to breaking through or bridging, let's say, the various silos in which academics tend to work. Can you tell us a bit about your view of interdisciplinarity and the relationship and the importance of that?
Well, just as problems can never be solved at this level which set them, problems can probably be never completely or much solved in the discipline which creates them. So I've always felt that you have to combine disciplines. Now, obviously in a way it's odd that people aren't more used to this, because at school, when you do English, you also do English literature and English language and maybe other countries' literatures and languages, and then you do a bit of history and you do a bit of geography, and you're doing that all at the same time, and your mind is probably occasionally thinking, well, what I learned in geography is relevant to what I'm learning in history, and so on. So you're linking them together. But part of the, not exactly disease, but the feature of academic life is to teach you that the narrower you become, the more successful you become. Certainly if you go on from an undergraduate degree to... So as an undergraduate, you begin to specialise somewhat, both in that discipline and in some sub-part of that discipline. And then when you go on to your PhD, you do it even more so. One particular part of the world and one particular problem. And then when you come to teach, there are all these other people around who have their own territories, and you have this territory, and you leave it to them, and they would be worried if you started it. And likewise, you have people in other disciplines. So moving across into either your colleagues or other disciplinary territories, you're going to meet hostility and be told it's, you can't do it unless. One of the wonderful things of coming to Cambridge, which I learnt very early on, because when I came, I'd already moved from history into anthropology and had a double training. I came back as a historian, so I moved back twice between disciplines. And I joined something called the Fellowship Electors of King's College. I was 30, and I sat round the table with a dozen people, of whom about 8 were Nobel Prize winning level people like Martin Rees, who didn't of course get a Nobel Prize because he's not one in his subject, Sidney Brenner, who did, and others. And they were, absolutely, they were world figures in their fields. And there were no disciplinary boundaries. Sidney was the cleverest man in Cambridge, so it was reputed. And whatever the subject was, medieval literature, there was Sidney telling us, this is a great thesis on medieval literature, and so on. And we weren't, some mathematician came along, and we as arts people were expected to have some views on this. We didn't know any maths, but did we get a sense of how this guy was? And so I realised that at the top level of all disciplines, the boundaries disappear, that you are all pursuing a common sort of subject. And the basic questions are the same, really, right across the disciplines. It's just the methods that somewhat differ. And I also learned gradually not to worry. Luckily I'm probably pretty deaf, literally and metaphorically, because the people who were muttering in the background, saying, well, he's not. I really realised it was all nonsense, because one of my early books was reviewed by the leading reviewer of English history at the time, one of them, J.P. Kenyon, and he wrote a review saying, this was my first book, I think, The Family Life of Ralph Jocelyn. He wrote a review saying, unfortunately, Dr. Macfarlane is not a historian. If he had been, he would realise this was rubbish. So I did write back to the paper and said, well, I do have a BA and DPhil in history at Oxford. I suppose that doesn't qualify me as a historian. I realised they couldn't tell whether I was a historian or not, they just had their views. So I disregard any of that. And I also had another inspirational example, which was Jack Goody, because Jack and Ernest, my two mentors were Jack Goody and Ernest. Now, Ernest, as you know, is the only person in the history I know of who had been one time or another professor of sociology, anthropology, and philosophy, and has a doctorate in anthropology, but also, so he bridged three disciplines pretty successfully and didn't worry about them, whichever one he was in. Jack was the same. He hadn't got that those positions, but you know, he was not frightened to roam into all sorts of new subjects and new ways of learning and get them up. So both of these people said, you can do it. And so I did try and do it.
That's very interesting. It's common, of course, in many universities to cluster subjects into faculties and divisions and so on, such as social sciences as distinct from humanities, as distinct from biological sciences. Do you think there's anything that really intellectually or otherwise justifies this ghettoization of the social sciences as a distinct cluster? Or do you, I shouldn't say ghettoization to imply that it's negative. I mean, it might have a very strong positive argument for it, but I'm curious to know whether you think there's a case for that, and or whether you think it's actually quite destructive to the advancement of our intellectual goals as academics.
Well, I've never sort of encountered it very much. I was in the faculty of archaeology, bioanth, and anthropology, and we had, I mean, you've got to keep attention. One of my very closest friends and advisors was an engineer and industrialist, and he came out with this wonderful phrase which he thought summed up how science proceeds, which was bounded but leaky. You've got to have boundaries as a community. I mean, if you just say, let's not have departments and faculties and schools, people will be lost, just as they need colleges and what. So you need these subunits, but the trick is not to turn them, as my future provost, my forthcoming provost to this college in 3 months, 2 months, has written a book on silos, on business silos. They mustn't turn into silos. So you've got to have leakiness. So you have your community, but you then go out from it and meet people in from other communities and welcome them in. If they just wash across, if you don't have the boundaries and they just wash, you get a mishmash and no progress. So it's the tension between these two things which leads to productivity and creativity. And that again was fostered by a place, as you know, in like Oxford and Cambridge, because in Magdalen and King's, you sit down at dinner and you're next to, you know, a molecular biologist or a mathematician or a whatever, and you're meant to be able to chat about things, and you soon discover that there are things they're interested in, your subject, and you, so on. Whereas in most universities, even, and certainly in the world generally, you cluster together in your own discipline, and there's no, certainly in Japanese and Chinese universities, that's the case.
There are so many dimensions to your academic career that I'm curious about. So I'm going to shift on to another topic, which is fieldwork, which has been a very important part of your career. If you could choose to do fieldwork, and start your career all over again, do fieldwork anywhere you liked, where would you do it and why?
Well, the problem is that the kind of, if you're talking, there is a kind of fieldwork which I was trained in at the LSE, and which was structural functional anthropological fieldwork, where you went to a place for 15 months or as you did, your kind, and you learnt the language, and you did this intensive study in the hope that it might generate findings which were larger than the particular. That kind of fieldwork now is very difficult to do, and because the world hasn't got these little remote pools of where you can go, as I did in the Himalayas and you in Borneo and New Guinea. So if I was going to do that kind of field work, there are only very few places I could do it in. One of the people I interviewed recently and has written very interesting work is Philippe Descola, and he could still go. Oh, that was some time ago, but I imagine there are bits of Amazonia or even New Guinea. On the other hand, you don't have to go there. You just go to London. I've just been up to North London, Edgware, last weekend to meet some of the people I worked with, the Guruns, who I've known. She's my adopted sister, and she was 3 when I first met her, and she's now 58 or something. And that area you could easily do field work in because it's basically Indian and Nepali. And it's got a lot of all the features of field work. And it would be very interesting to go there or somewhere else. If I were to do the kind of field work I do now, which is entirely what I call friendship field work, this is based on perhaps laziness. I haven't got the time to learn a new language. So when I went to Japan and when I went to China, I said to myself, it's either learning the language or doing the work. I'll do the work. And so what I found in Japan was that I found 2 very, very intelligent, interesting Japanese, spoke very good English and knew Oxford and Cambridge and so on. They wanted to learn about England. I wanted to learn about Japan. So we spent 15 years getting to know each other and getting to know each other's cultures through long conversations and testing. They'd say, well, why are you so religious, Alan? And I said, I'm not religious at all. And they said, of course you are. Your whole life is seeped in religions. You may not think you go to church, but your philosophy, your poetry, everything is religion. So I learnt about myself, and then I would say to them, well, why are you so irreligious? Why don't you have any God? And so we kept on this conversation. I wrote my book out of that friendship. The same in China. I've written now a couple of books about China based on deep friendships with my PhD students and 1 or 2 other Chinese, where we trust each other. They know their culture, and I'm experienced enough to know some questions to ask them, and they say, yes, you're right, or this, you should understand this or not. The person you met recently, Zilan, has taught me a vast amount about China through travelling with her and also watching her family growing up in Cambridge and through our endless conversations and getting things done in Cambridge. And that kind of field work is very suitable for an elderly gentleman.
Well, we're almost out of time, so I'm afraid this probably has to be the last question. But it's really, I'd like to ask you a sort of version of the last question, except wearing your historian's hat. If you could study the history of any time period, any part of the world, at the beginning of your career and make it something, a big feature of your intellectual life over the course of your career, where and when would you choose to do it?
Well, someone asked me this, so I'm going to give you a totally facetious answer, so it's at the top of my mind. They said, where would you have liked to have been born and looked at? And I said, the Garden of Eden. So I would have liked to have been a field worker in the Garden of Eden, because I'd have observed this, to me, pathetic situation where you have God who is omnipotent, all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving, all-everything. He sets up a stage in which there are 2 entirely innocent creatures. He then sends along evil in the form of a serpent. He then shows them an apple, which he just says, don't eat it. He doesn't say why not eat it and so on. And the evil principle he sent in says, eat it. And so they do that, and then the rest is pain, sin, and misery for the human beings for the rest of time. Now, I would like to be in a field worker watching this and maybe intervening and saying, you know, what are you doing? I mean, could you not have thought, you're all-knowing and all-thinking, can you not think of a better solution? If you want to give us some sort of freedom and free will, do you have to do it in this way? There must be a better way, because you know that Hiroshima is coming, and you know that Holocaust is coming, you know the bubonic plague is coming, and so on and so on, because you can see the future. So why are you doing this?
Well, on those unanswerable rhetorical questions, sadly we must end, but thank you very, very much, Alan. That was fascinating.